Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 251 of Humanity Rising. It's an auspicious day today. This is the day of the full moon. It was called Wormwood for the month of May by the Farmer's Almanac. This is the time of the year where under the magnetic pull of the full moon, the worms come out and play. And the Native Americans called it the eagle moon or the goose moon. But this full moon is particularly auspicious in the Buddhist tradition because by tradition, the Buddha was born on the full moon in May. He gained enlightenment on the full moon in May, and then passed into nirvana on the full moon in May. So this is a full moon of great wonder and glory. So as we begin Humanity Rising today, let us just take in that we're part of an intricately working universe that ticks away full moon after full moon, month after month, year after year, with a perfection that cradles life, cradles everything that we do within a loving, supportive, nurturing cosmos. Let us pause, as we always do, as we begin this session, and take a few deep breaths. Center yourself in your body and on your heart. And for the next minute or two, just listen to your heartbeat in a spirit of gratitude and thanksgiving that you're alive. We're all alive on this full moon at this extraordinary juncture in the human journey. Thank you, everyone. And now, with an open heart and a heart full of gratitude and love for each and every one of you joining the session today, I want to commence our program by recalling that yesterday, just before the full moon, we celebrated the first anniversary of the death of George Floyd. And one of the points that was made was that what made his death so iconic globally was that it was a death that called us all to a great reckoning. The pandemic is doing that. The pandemic, like Floyd's death, has stopped our world. And we all know that in some fundamentally existential way, we're in a great reckoning. both in terms of our relationship with nature and in terms of our relationship with each other. Racism is a scourge on the American soul and the scourge on the soul of the world. And perhaps no exercise between human beings is more urgent right now than respecting diversity, honoring difference, celebrating difference and diversity within the context of a larger wholeness within which we embrace all the distinctions that we can fathom. And that brings us to the imperative for engaging in dialogue. You know, dialogue comes from the Greek dia and logos. It's about speaking truth, but not in the sense of a discussion among intellectuals, but in terms of a dialogue that emerges out of deep listening to the other. Dialogue is what the world needs. And so today we're very honored and privileged to have an exercise in dialogue that's going to be convened by George Cappanelli. He was the one who brought to Humanity Rising a session right before the inauguration on January 19th, which was a celebration of democracy in America. And now George is back. You know that he's an award-winning author. He's an Emmy Award-winning producer and director. He is the co-founder of Age Nation and a PBS series, Timeless Living, that is currently airing on public broadcasting stations all across the United States. So George has wanted to do something for Humanity Rising. So he is going to be convening a series of dialogues, not only on content that is important, but in a way that exemplifies the deep listening that should characterize all true dialogue. So George, I want to welcome you to Humanity Rising and turn the program over to you. Welcome.
George Cappanelli. I'm the co-founder of Age Nation and Empower New Mexico, the co-producer and director of the Ageless Living television series, and your host. So I want to welcome you to the dialogues. This is a place where well-known authors, experts, and change agents come to explore some of the systemic issues of our time. And at the same time to offer insights, perspectives, concerns, and potential solutions. A second reason for this series of programs is to demonstrate that in times of great challenge, even when we're deeply divided, people who are committed to supporting the greater good of the greatest number can express their points of view with passion, but with respect, can offer divergent opinions, but at the same time can listen genuinely, creatively, actively to each other, so that there is the possibility to come to greater understanding and also perhaps to reach agreement. During our time together, we're going to use the dialogue process. Dialogue is a word from the Greek word dialogos, which means to arrive at truth and common ground or common understanding through active listening with heart and mind. This differs, of course, from discussion. Discussion comes from the Latin word discutere, and as most of us know, because we've participated in so many discussions, the definition to shatter into pieces is really what often results. So during our time together, we're going to address key topics. Each topic will be framed by a different participant in the dialogue. And we want you to know up front that we're not going to be interrupting the flow or the integrity of the dialogue to address your questions or your comments. But if you'll take note of them in the chat that will immediately follow, we'll be delighted to address them. So we're delighted to be joined by this really terrific panel of both friends and colleagues. Larry Dossie is an MD. I'm going to ask you each when I introduce you, since your names are not yet under your pictures, if you'll just raise your hands. Larry Dossie is an MD, a retired practitioner of internal medicine, former chief of staff of Medical City Dallas Hospital. He's the author of 13 books, a number of which are New York Times bestsellers, that explore relationship and spirituality health, and hundreds of essays and articles. Barbara Dossie is internationally recognized as an integrative holistic nursing practitioner, a nurse theorist, the co-author of Theory of Integrative Nurse Coaching, and a Florence Nightingale Scholar. Paul Levy has spent most of his adult life studying Wetiko, which you're going to learn about tonight. He's the author of Dispelling Wetiko, Breaking the Curse of Evil, and the Quantum Revolution, a radical synthesis of science and spirituality. Paul also has 2 new books on Wetiko coming out, one next fall and one in 2022. Tom Eddington is one of Silicon Valley's most sought-after coaches and consultants. He works with some of the nation's leading CEOs, nonprofit leaders, advising them on everything from global mergers and organizational change to conscious leadership. He's also launched a number of really critical biodiversity programs, including his latest called Endangered, which seeks to raise millions of dollars to help rescue 12 endangered species. Gordon de Veren is an organization and human development consultant, spiritual director, and co-founder of the Claritas Institute of Interspiritual Inquiry. He's co-authored 2 books, Saying Yes to Change and Your Soul's Compass. Gordon's the founding director and active board member of PassageWorks Institute, dedicated to social, emotional, and spiritual learning of children and youth in our schools. Celeste Kruger is founder and president of Celeste Kruger and Associates, a leadership and organizational development firm dedicated to helping people name their purpose and deliver it with passion. A change agent for more than 30 years, Celeste focuses on building communities, organizations, and teams and strengthening their capacity. Michael Negler is professor emeritus of classics and comparative literature at UC Berkeley, where he founded the Peace and Conflict Studies program, taught upper division courses on nonviolence, meditation, and a seminar on the meaning of life, which I'm still waiting to take. He's president of the Meta Center for Nonviolence and the author of The Search for a Nonviolent Future, The Nonviolent Handbook, and The Third Harmony, both the book and the film. Terry Tillman is an internationally recognized human resource consultant. Under his 227 company, he's dedicated and focused on facilitating, teaching, presenting, training, and coaching people and organizations to experience more of what they want out of life. He's also a leadership expert, a leader in outdoor challenge and experiential education, and author of Writings on the Wall, Peace at the Berlin Wall. My partner, life and work, Sedina, is an expert on individual, societal, and organizational change. She's a best-selling author. She's also the co-founder of Age Nation and Empower New Mexico, and the co-producer of the Ageless Living television series. And she's a health and wellness expert that leads women's trainings in different parts of the world, teaching empowerment, vitality, and beauty from the inside out. Heidi Sparks Buber sent me a piece earlier that I seem to have lost, but I remember her saying that one of the things she wants you to know is that she lives in New Mexico and just loves being under these big and gracious skies. She's also a master trainer, program consultant for Insight Education Systems, founding partner of the Four Quadrant Partners. Heidi Gruber has over 30 years of experience bringing learning-based performance and strategic leadership to a wide variety of private, public, and government organizations in Europe, the US, South America, and Asia. So that's our team. Heidi, you're going to lead us off with a question, huh? You're on mute.
Yes, I have a question for us. In the face of the seeming madness of our time, I mean, we see it everywhere. We see it environmentally, politically, health-wise. In the face of that madness, in which we humans seem to be compelled to act against our own best interests, how do each of you, and how do we respond in a way that brings us back to unity, back to sanity together, and on track for a positive future? I'd really like to start with you, Paul, since you've been immersed in this question for a long time.
Yeah, for sure. Thank
Tell
you.
us something about it. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I've devoted my life to answering this question, and the Native Americans have a word, Watiko, which is this virus of the mind that is at the source of the madness that's playing out and of the evil that's playing out in our world. And and people who hear my work when I'll write about this mind virus, they might think, oh, that's woo-woo, that's crazy. But it's so obviously true that the source of the madness that our species is playing out is to be found within the psyche. That's in essence what Watiko is about. It's a collective psychosis, and we're in the middle of a collective psychosis. I mean, that's obvious. And I would like to add that people who understand what Watiko is, there's not one person who doesn't agree that it's the most important thing to understand in our world. Because if we don't understand what this mind virus is about, we're just going to continue to destroy ourselves. But the thing about this mind virus, it's so unbelievable because it's a quantum phenomena. And what that means is that it has a superposition of states, that it's both the source of the deepest insanity and poison and evil and madness that we, are playing out, and encoded, hidden within the mind virus is its own vaccine, that it's actually helping us to wake up, that if Watiko didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. It's actually the greatest catalyst for the evolution of our species that there's ever been. But the thing about Watiko, it works through the unconscious. It works through the unconscious, through the part of us that has blind spots. It's a form of psychic blindness, you could say. And because it operates through the blind spots, through the projective tendencies of the mind, if we're not awake to Watiko, we then become entranced. We then hypnotize ourselves and then unwittingly become an instrument to act it out. So being a form of blindness, what that means is that it only has power over us to the extent that it's not seen, okay? So what that means is that when we begin to see Watiko, to see how it operates in the world and how it operates inside of our minds, then we take away its power. And not only do we take away its power over us, but we become empowered. So the thing about Watiko, just to give you a sense, people who hear about it, they go, oh, I know what it is. After a minute, they'll say, oh, it's like the shadow or the lower self. That's like seeing 0.001% of it. It's this multidimensional, higher dimensional sort of entity that doesn't even exist. It doesn't have any existence other than within our own mind. So there's nothing to be afraid of. But the thing about Watiko, it's an inner disease of the soul. It's a psychospiritual disease of the soul that somehow is able to extend itself out in the world and configure what's happening in the world so as to reflect the inner state of a psyche that's under its thrall. Now that's amazing, because that's a description, that's a description of being in this dream. Because what a dream is it's an outer circumstance that's reflecting the inner state of the psyche of the dreamer. So what I'm saying is that the way to begin to have the recognition of Wetiko is to see the dreamlike nature. When you see the dreamlike nature, you recognize that we're just characters in each other's dreams, that we're not separate from each other, that we're interdependent and interconnected. And the expression of that is this compassion. That compassion, that's the medicine for Wetiko, and Wetiko actually invokes that compassion. But if we don't have the recognition of what it's showing us, we're going to continue to destroy ourselves. But if we actually just have the realization of what Wetiko is showing us in our face, then we can begin to wake up and access our creative power. Because Wetiko, the final thing, we have this immense creative power at our disposal 24/7, all of us. But to the extent that we don't know it, Wetiko plugs into our creativity and turns it against us in a way that is killing us. But when we see that, we're able to access our agency, our creative power, in a way that actually is serving us and is actually helping the whole. So that's just a little bit. I mean, I could go on forever, but that maybe is just a short intro about Wetiko.
Thanks, Paul. I want to mention for those of you who are joining us that one thing that Paul did not say was that the term Wetiko comes from the indigenous people, among other places. And the Algonquin, the Ojibwe, the Cree, all had words in their language to describe this virus of the mind or disease of the soul, depending on whose definition you follow. In addition, I know Paul is a student of Jung, and Jung also talked. Paul, what was the name that Jung gave?
Yeah, Jung was totally switched on to Wetiko, but he didn't have the name for it. And because I know Jung so well, the one name that he would use more than any other name was totalitarian psychosis. And that's perfect because, you know, the thing about Wetiko, it's an inner disease of the soul that explicates itself through the outer world. So think about it. Wetiko, the mind virus, gets in our mind. It creates this, you know, it colonizes the psyche, creates a shadow government. And, you know, so what is happening in the world with creeping fascism all over the planet? That's a reflection of how the Wetiko virus operates inside of an individual psyche.
Thanks. Heidi, would you just repeat the second part of the question?
Yes. In the face of this, because it seems you're speaking about it, it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere, and that need to see it. So in the face of it, actually, in the face of it, seeing it, how do each of you on this call, how do each of you and how shall we respond to it in a way that brings us back to sanity together, to some kind of unity and on track for a more positive future? I'm interested in each person's experience of that and what you find is your way back.
Might I weigh in at this point?
Yeah.
Please, Michael.
Yeah. I want to put a kind of a frame around everything that Paul said, none of which I disagree with. I might want to put it in somewhat different terms, but that wouldn't be significant. But what is significant is to put it in a historic framework that we can understand. And quite simply, what we're experiencing culture-wide and even wider is we're in a state of paradigm breakdown, to use the terms that are common for this, and we do not yet have a new paradigm. So what was the old paradigm? What would the new one be? And what can we do to create that shift? Well, the old one can really be, it's kind of unfortunate, but it can be summed up really in one sentence. The old idea, the old model, the old story, some people call it, is that we are separate material beings in a random universe and therefore condemned to competition and violence. And they add one other little item, and that is that our evolution is over. Now, every single point of this paradigm or framework is wrong. And there is both, there's always been indigenous wisdom to tell us, no, there is another story that actually works better if you try it out. But we now have the voice of science, of what is sometimes called new science, weighing in various ways. So the new story is that we're not separate and we're not material. In fact, we're not separate because we're not material. We have, at the very least, body, mind, and consciousness. And in ancient India, it was a little bit more segmented than that, but enough to say that whereas in the West, we tended to say, do we have a soul? It's a big theological question. In India, the question always was, do we have a body? Because who do you think is asking the question? Do you think your inert body is asking that question? Impossible. So we are, in fact, conscious beings in a deeply meaningful universe. You can get some of what this meaning is when you look at the powerful, impressive evolution of consciousness over the 13 point what billion years. And that because we aren't material beings and we aren't separate from one another, we are not condemned to competition or violence. It's just this sense of lack and has led to the overconsumption that has led to the competition, while the sense of separateness has led to the potential for violence. So, and one other thing, whereas the old story that we've been operating under culture-wide for, about 200, 250 years, saying that in addition, our evolution is over, well, you can give that the lie immediately if you look at, for example, my favorite example is Mahatma Gandhi. Sure, our evolution is over as far as our physical bodies is concerned, but they're just a platform. They're just a launching pad for our spirituality, which is where we have an infinite potential for growth, which is where all that creativity that Paul was talking about can be mobilized and brought into, put in play. And that's what the Meta Center has been working on with this Third Harmony project, our book, our film, and yes, we even have a board game. For those of you who are interested, people as young as 8 years old have been known to get up before breakfast and run and play the board game. I had nothing to do with it, by the way. So this is not exactly boasting, it's just paternal pride. But anyway, the Third Harmony project is a plan for shifting from the disastrous old story to an extremely challenging, but very, very hopeful new one.
Thank you, Michael. Who's next?
I'm happy to go. This group has been meeting once a week for months, I think, and it wasn't until today that I learned what I've learned about each one of you, George's introduction. And what am I doing here, I had the same feeling when I was invited into a group that probably the who's who of my industry, and found out that, yeah, I can fit in just fine. And that's to say, I think anybody can fit into this conversation. I think it's inherent in anybody. Someone introduced me once as a recovering businessman, more accurately. And I did an about face and entered the world of human potential. And one of my first mentors, I heard say one day, there's no one else out there. And I wondered, what the heck? What are you saying? There's no one else out there. There's John and Mary and Paul. And of course there are people out there. And she was teaching me how to work with people and in a group and individually. And she would do something that I thought was astounding. Like, how did you know that about them? And she said, well, I just looked in me. So you take the next one. take the next one. What? I don't know what to do. And she said, well, when they say something, you go inside and find out where they are. I didn't have a clue. I now know what that's about. And I see this as, and it's my language for what I'm hearing Paul say, and Michael. And, I've watched physics, science, and metaphysics, which has been my field, come together to where they're in agreement. What I've been teaching metaphysically for 5 years is now got quantum physics proof. And a lot of that is there is no separation. We're one. There's no us and them. And the recognition of that, I think first just consciously is the step toward the solution. And so for me, that's very real now. It's not just a theory. It's not mental construct. It's not an idea. It's very real. So for example, if I'm triggered by somebody, my solution isn't to try to get them to change or give them negative feedback. It's just the mirror. Like I wouldn't have any idea what that is I'm seeing if it weren't in me. And if I'm not in agreement with it or in harmony with it, then I better go back inside and find a way to balance it and clear it and clean it or whatever I need to do. So it's all in here. And for years I've done leadership trainings with large groups, small groups, businesses, teams, and I call it inside out leadership. And that's been the approach I've taken. It's all inside out, and all that means you got to turn it upside down, inside out, and change it from how I was taught. Like there's a guy in front, he's the leader, and he tells people what to do. He gains some skills on how to do that. That doesn't work, and we're discovering that based on the result we're seeing in the world. It's not working that way. So I go on and on and on, but inside out. This whole solution is I got to deal with it in here, and when I do here, I'm doing it for everybody. The Chinese, when I worked there, one of them told me, he said, we have a saying that if everyone swept in front of their own door, soon the whole street would be clean. And let me finish with another thought I really like, biology and ecotone. An ecotone is a zone of change. And my best example is when the ocean is coming to the land, it's not ocean or land yet. That zone in between is the ecotone. It's the zone of change. It has turbulence with it, but it also has a lot of beauty and interest and awareness and learning and depth. And I see that's where we are now. And hopefully we're dispelling with eco in the ecotone here.
Thanks, Terry.
Yeah.
Heidi, would you ask the question again? I want to hear it again in context of what's showing up, please.
Yes, absolutely. So in the face of the seeming madness of our time, and Paul told us a little bit more about that, in which we humans seem to be compelled to act against our own best interests. We've seen this everywhere. How do each of you respond in a way that brings you back to unity or to sanity? And how shall we do that? So I'd like to hear some personal stories about a time that you saw this operative, and what did you do that allowed you to come back into the sanity and on track for a positive future? Because in that state, there's no way that you can be imagining, anything better. The imaginal cells simply aren't working. So what have you done? What have you seen yourself doing when you've been able to encounter and live with that, transcend that? And what have you discovered that we could do?
I'll speak.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, good, Barbie.
Dr. Barbara.
Oh, I reflect back with that question when I got out of nursing school in 1965, just excited about being a registered nurse and working in critical care. And at that particular time, it was also a time when we had the beginning of relaxation and imagery and therapeutic touch and music and all these different complementary and alternative therapies. Well, in traditional critical care and in nursing, period, it was not there. But then, like many of you, I attended many, many workshops over my 56 years in the profession. And to go from one place to another and then to try to implement some of these possibilities. And I think the thing that has been my gift all along is to recognize is you can't change anybody, but if you come together in this we space and you begin to share ideas and what do you think about this, and wait and be present for the reflection, something begins to happen. And then the privilege of just always finding who my soul brother or soul sister are in doing this work. And then with that, putting the art and the science together of the discipline. And then with that becomes this awakened consciousness. And when you practice these different modalities yourself, you're changed. And so if that changed, there was no way that I could go into a critical care unit and not engage the consciousness of the patients and their family that I had the privilege of being with that day. So I think that's the one thing, is this awakened consciousness and finding your soulmate. And I am blessed that I've 54 years been in tandem with one who has an awakened consciousness. And it's just so exciting to, work all day and then at the end of the day to just say, okay, what did you do today and what's going on? And then to work with like-minded brothers and sisters. And so now the thing that keeps me going is one thing that we have found in this pandemic is that we indeed are a global village and have like-minded colleagues all over the world, and to look at stories that we can tell, to begin to look at compassion and caring and healing. So I'm going to stop right there. Thank you.
Celeste, did you want to?
Or I'll pick up, because Barbara, you gave me a nice segue, the
Okay.
compassion part and the brothers and sisters part. I'm thinking of a very recent story, Heidi, in response to your question. I was in New York City last week. It's the first time I've traveled, my husband and I together, since before COVID began. And I haven't been in the city in maybe 3 or 4 years. And we were shocked at a number of things. It's still very closed down at the time of this recording. By that, I mean, it's very quiet on the streets. A lot of the stores are either closed permanently or just opening. People are wearing masks all over the place. There's a tentativeness in the space that I had never imagined. I don't think I was fully prepared for it. And I knew I wasn't prepared when we had this experience. Along Fifth Avenue, we were window gazing and decided to go into a store just to look around and have the experience of touching things. More salespeople on the floor than people there to look at things or to buy things. And it was very quiet. And all of a sudden, behind me, this man came bursting into the store, screaming at the top of his lungs, angry, railing at the government, at his father, at the people on the floor, at the store. Big energy and frightening energy to me. I immediately tensed up. I looked over, he had a backpack on. You can imagine where my head went with that. I made up all kinds of instantaneous stories. And it wasn't true that he was there to do imminent harm to anyone. It was true that he was in agony. And almost in that moment when I saw his face, I felt a deep sense of sadness for him, but also a gratitude, because he was acting out like the tuning fork for all of us. What's happening on the globe, inside of us, in our nation, and you can follow that thread. And almost as quickly as he burst into that place, he left. And the people on the floor were just stunned and clearly paralyzed almost. And my inclination was odd that it was so natural, but I turned to this woman who was next to me and I said to her, "What's your name?" And she told me, and she teared up and I teared up. And I said to her, "It's been," she said, "Are you from here?" And I said, "No, we're not from here." And she started to cry. And she began to tell a little bit of the story of this last, 9, 12 months, 12 and a half, 16, who knows. I tell you the story because Watiko showed up in the middle of us, left momentarily, and what was left in that liminal space between was the chance for contact and compassion. And sometimes right now, that's all I know to do, is to go right toward it. I'm still processing that, but that would be a piece of, Heidi, what I'm learning about. What's your name? Where can we connect? I like that.
Could, in order for me to do some of the switching back and forth between people as they speak, if everyone who isn't speaking would go on mute, that will prevent little random noises from having the camera jump to everyone. So if you'd all go on mute, except the next person that would like to speak, that would be terrific.
Is it okay, George, to say one thing? I just wanted to, that story, Celeste, was so beautiful because the moment that you had the recognition that that guy who was embodying, you could say Watiko, that he was a tuning fork that was actually an oracle for what was in the collective unconscious, in other words, all of us, that was when you had your shift of consciousness from like seeing Watiko and like reacting in fear and then separation, which would mean you would then be an instrument for Watiko, to actually recognize as it shows up and have that compassion. That's the very medicine right there.
Larry.
I'm reminded of a comment by Alan Watts, the great Zen teacher, who said once that good and evil are in cahoots with one another, and we cannot have one and simultaneously have knowledge of the other. And I think that there is great wisdom in that, and I say that also from my practice of internal medicine. I don't think we would have a very well-developed concept of human health unless we experienced human illness fairly frequently. So in some sense, opposites define one another. And I think this is a deep learning that we forget continually in our human form. We want it one way or the other. And we tend to see Watiko as the enemy when I think it helps us define the good. I think that there is an very strong oppositional force in human nature against Watiko and the negative, dark side of things, which we commonly try to eliminate. And I think it's goodness. I think goodness is inherent in humans, just like the dark side is. And I think you can't get rid of it. I'll just give you one example. And I think I'm talking science here and not New Age fluff. If you take two people who are emotionally connected, like a loving husband and a loving wife, and you separate them on the other side of the earth, and this has actually been done, and you do an EEG on one of them, and you shine a bright light in their face, you disturb the EEG, and simultaneously, at the same time, the EEG of the loving partner on the other side of the earth changes instantly in the same direction. in the same degree. This is not supposed to be possible. And these experiments are very little known because we're so dedicated to the principle of individuality and separateness, but it's a complete fiction. And there's an enormous body of evidence looking at simultaneous brain function at a distance and loving emotionally close people that just destroys this idea that we're separate, isolated, disconnected individuals. It's a fiction. And I think if we were to grasp this idea of unity and connectivity, we would have a better future in store for us on this planet. George.
I have a few thoughts that I want to share about in answer to the question on a personal level. What always brings me back to greater sanity is, first of all, being in touch with the earth. Just the smells, the scents, the touches, the feelings remind me of my connectivity to the habitat that I live in. A second thing that always brings me back is when I exercise my creativity. There is no when I'm not exercising my creativity, it's like I've pulled a plug out of the wall and there's no juice, no power that flows through me. But as soon as I pick up a sculpting tool or a pen or a paintbrush or sit down and bang something silly on a musical keyboard, something happens that lets me reconnect to the whole. And I'm not as lost as I was before. And the third thing is, when I deal with my own crap, I mean the stuff that I project out into the world, that I think is somebody else's responsibility, and take that back and begin to work on it and forgive myself for the projection and for having the crap in the first place, something miraculous happens inside of me, and I return to some level of sanity. So that's my contribution for the moment. Someone who hasn't shared yet, because we do have a limited amount of time and I want to make sure that everyone has a chance to speak. Sedina?
But you were going to do that. I loved your story, Celeste. That was beautiful. And it reminds me of, well, I had kind of I didn't realize it until Paul was describing it, and such a great question, Heidi. So I had an encounter with a loved one a while back when we had a different president, and it was really hard to deal with. What I noticed about myself was that I was in resistance. That was the biggest thing I could see, that the person coming toward me was opposing, criticizing, resenting, and I was doing the same thing. That was the resistance that I was giving. And what I've discovered is that non-resistance is infinitely more powerful. So what I do now is I try to look for similarities. I may not immediately find a solution to whatever it is, but I'm willing to see it. If I allow my mind to seek agreement, I can find the agreement. It'll be there. And I totally resonated with what you were saying as well, Michael. So for me, it's about wholeness. That's sort of what I end up teaching too. And all the separateness and the disconnect for me comes from a lack of embracing all of me. Realizing, yeah, I screwed up. Oh, I was in resistance. I did this. I I didn't respond. I reacted really quickly. It was knee jerk. I don't need to do that. But just the awareness of it and embracing my wholeness. I'm going to have missteps. I'm going to have wins. There's a lot of things that are going to go wonky. So what? I can love myself for who I am. And I think that's really, for me, what's going on in the world with separateness is that we're so honed in our culture to be perfect all the time, that if we're not perfect, then we point fingers. And it's just time to embrace everybody around us for who they are, regardless if they're like us. That's the big thing up right now, isn't it? Is, oh, she's not, even, prejudice, all of it is all about, well, you're not like me. Who wants that? I mean, I don't want everybody to look the same. And compassion, opening ourselves up to the mystery within. So for me, it's strengthening myself inwardly and looking for the beauty. When I look for the beauty within, I can also accept and embrace the darkness. That's what I've got.
Larry?
I would just like to add that I think most people are sort of habituated to this materialistic idea that permeates our culture, that we're all a function of the chemistry and anatomy of our individual brains, and that's what science says. I take exception to that, and I think that the views of some of the outstanding scientists of our day have been overlooked. And I would just mention two of them which make the point. David Bohm, one of the greatest scientists of this century, said, deep down, the consciousness of mankind is one. And Erwin Schrödinger, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1933, said this: the overall number of minds is just one. Deep down, the consciousness of mankind is one. So I know that people hearing this for the first time may think that this unity and connectivity stuff is just California New Age BS. It can easily be ignored, but the outstanding scientists of our time have held this view, and I think this is not to be underestimated.
Thank you, Larry. Someone who hasn't spoken yet. Gordy? You're on mute. There you go.
Yes, I'm now, for viewers, I'm using my wife Joan Borisenko's computer tonight. So if you're confused by the name under my face, in some ways, it seems to me that the real pivot here is the shift from narcissism to presence. And that sense of disconnection, the sense of comparison, the projection out, all of that, which is kind of the way Wetiko functions, comes from a place of mistaken identity. And I think of Abe Maslow, a quote I've always remembered is, the people we call sick are the people who are not themselves. The people who have all kinds of defenses against simply being human, simply being human. And that, while that sounds simple, in the world we're living in now, that seems like a very distant prospect. However, I remember the experiences I had, 40 years ago when I was facilitating encounter groups in Carl Rogers' program at UC La Jolla. And every time I would be with a group, 10 people in a dorm room, and watched the drama play out. And people were either being dependent or counter-dependent. in the way that they acted, but certainly not real, not themselves, defensive. And but by just holding the space, one by one, a person would become real, would say something real that I would respond to. And then that became like an anchor. And gradually, one by one, and I used to think of it as like a string of Christmas tree lights, that not until you screw in the last bulb does the whole string light up. And Carl Rogers called that the wisdom of the group, but there was such a sense of harmony, of oneness, absolutely beautiful. And it wasn't a fluke. It happened every time. And it was simply the function of being real and being present with others. So I have that as, one of my deepest recollections of what's possible. And so then when you talk about evolution, is evolution over? I belong to a group called the Evolutionary Leaders Circle, as does Larry and Barbie. And this year we published a book called Our Moment of Choice. And the contribution that I made with some assistance from my wife was an essay called The Noble Future, Becoming Fully Human. And so this is something that frustrates me so much because, thinking in terms of meta-narratives and meta-solutions, whereas if we were farmers, we would say, what is it we want to grow? How do we cultivate it? How do we create the right soil for it to grow? And so what is in fact the right kind of holding children come into this world? Larry, the book, The Spiritual Child, I can't remember her name, the psychologist from Columbia, that children are born into this world deeply connected to the whole field of being. And then it's the question of how do parenting and schooling happen in such a way that deep connection is either responded to or not. Well, that's what seems to me, the kind of our model of education, our model of schooling for so many years has been really kind of an obedience model of schooling, and based on a very, very narrow scope of what human intelligence and human capacity is. Whereas, in fact, if we were to nurture, and we can, and there are more and more programs coming into being that do this, if we were to nurture the curiosity, the compassion, the creativity, the capacity to collaborate, the qualities that really do bring us into creative collaboration and the fulfillment of our each individual's unique gifts, if that in fact were to become our primary mission going forward, then we can consciously evolve. We can create the future we hope for, rather than simply being saddled with the collective trauma of past experience. So I'm just going to leave it there.
Thanks, Gordy. Tom, what about you?
This has been a wonderful dialogue, and I'm going to use the benefit of having listened to each of you and sort of weave a few thoughts together. So we can look at the scientific evidence that suggests we're facing the 6th mass extinction, and it's quite scary for people who are paying attention to that. We can look at the roughly 8 million species that are known on the planet, and 1 million of them are endangered, and that can become quite scary. We can look at, picking up on Michael's comment and Terry's comment about the paradigm shift that's happening, and it's needing to happen. It's happening for a variety of reasons, in part because our old systems are collapsing, because our society is collapsing, or at least as we have known it has and is collapsing. And yet it's collapsing in part because of the new consciousness that's evolving, that's showing up. And has the potential to be very, very scary. And yet, if we accept that it's part of an inevitable evolution of human consciousness, and we explore that, we embrace it without judgment, and we can stay open to both the fear and the hope. If we can be compassionate for ourselves, compassionate for others, as we're watching that wave meet the land, and see the beauty in it, and see the things that we don't know, we don't understand, but can appreciate what's wanting to emerge. It provides an opportunity for, in part, an ecological conversion, to embrace nature, to embrace our role in nature, that we are part of nature, we're not separate from nature, and to see ourselves as in a role of caring for each other and caring for nature in a way that we've held ourselves out as being over nature or separate from nature, and have exploited nature and each other. And so for me, I personally, my practice is one of compassion. And knowing that each of us is going through this, and it's our own journey, but it's painful to watch. It's painful to experience. And my personal practice is the self-compassion piece. I find it easier to have compassion for nature, to have compassion for others as the evolutionary wave is crashing on them, and the fear that arises. And yet, my work is having the same ability for self-compassion that I can have for others. And so that's my practice, that's my work.
Thank you, Tom. We're getting close to the end of the first part of this program. And for those of you who have been sitting by and saying, when me, I have this question and this comment to make, that time will happen soon. We're going to go into a little bit of a segue, and then we'll be with you, and you'll have the opportunity to share your questions and your comments with us. I think that there are two things that I'd like to leave you with at this juncture, and one is a quote that I use a great deal these days by Bucky Fuller, that says that we're born to be the architects of the future and not its victims. And I think that this moment in time gives each of us that opportunity. We may not be master architects. We may not even be able to draw a straight line, but we can indeed contribute to the architecture of the future. And the other thing that I want to leave you with for this moment anyway, is that when Paul spoke before, and he reminded us that in this anciently identified virus of the mind, or disease of the soul, lies not only the threat, but the cure. And I think that we are just in this dialogue at the beginning of that exploration. And we will look to pick it up again in future programs, using different topics that will deal with the same basic challenge that humanity faces. And I look forward to that opportunity, and I look forward to seeing you all briefly as we take this brief break and come back to address your comments and your questions. And on behalf of this really terrific group of people, I want to say thank you for listening to this part, and to the group itself, thanks for doing such an extraordinary job of demonstrating how different pieces can be brought together to help us understand each other. So we'll see you soon on the other side of this very short break.
Thank you, George. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And I'm wondering, George, what you might have in mind for the theme of this next session. But I must say, as we transition, that the ingredients of what was brought to bear were very powerful and exemplified dialogue at its best. And one of the initial queries that I would have, given that it was only yesterday we commemorated the 1-year anniversary of the death of George Floyd, is how would various of you apply what you know about dialogue and reconciliation to the larger issue of racism in America and the kind of healing that needs to take place?
Well, as usual, Jim, you ask great questions and complicated ones. In answer to the first part of your question, what could we focus on? I think that watching the chat, there have been some wonderful questions and comments and from viewers, and so we can handle or talk about any of those as they relate to this virus that is impacting this mind virus. Paul points out that Jung called it the totalitarian virus because it leads to the kind of detrimental impact on the world that we're seeing happen. So I'd love the thoughts of people in the audience on what they think of this virus of the mind. And it clearly impacts your other question about George Floyd and what do we do about racism? Because if there is a virus of the mind that is impacting us, one of its greatest manifestations is racism. And I think the only way we cure it is by remembering, as our good friend and companion on this, Larry Dossie, always suggests, that we are all one, and that this arbitrary separation because someone's skin color is a little different or their language or their culture is different is just a lot of bullshit that it is time for us to move beyond. And I think we have the capacity to do that now. So the rest of you, please jump in and share what you know, think about any and all of this.
I'll say a bit. It's a wonderful question, and I think each of us have our way about going about entering into dialogue. I have the privilege of being active in several nursing organizations and nursing groups, and it has been a joy to co-facilitate dialogue with colleagues. And yes, the Zoom is wonderful because you can enter 20 or 30 people in the chat. And the key that I have found with co-facilitating is just to announce it, bring it together, pose the questions such as we had tonight to begin our dialogue, and to share ground rules, because a lot of people who come on have not been in dialogue. So again, holding that deep container of listening to each other's story. Thank you.
Jim, I noticed one of the individuals in the chat asked for the correct spelling of Wetiko. Paul, do you want to give that and say a word or two?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So Wetiko is spelled W-E-T-I-K-O. And that's only one spelling of it. Each, tradition has maybe a different spelling or pronunciation, but that's the one I use. and I just wanted, because I had thoughts about the Floyd, the George Floyd killing that got brought up, in that to me it's such a reflection of the mind virus, because the mind virus, it inspires us to turn on ourselves. And if you see the George Floyd thing as this, this inner process that got played out in the outer world, here's the figure of the policeman, and then here's George Floyd, and they're not separate. And yet one of our parts turned on the other, turned on itself in a way to kill itself. And that's actually reflecting the actual process of the mind virus, of what we're unconsciously, what we're acting out in the world and in our own mind, to the extent that we're not awake to it.
Thanks for that, Paul. I've been thinking a lot about a year out from the killing of George Floyd. I imagine many of us have been. And when I look on the screen today, the good news is most of us here are very fair-skinned people. That's also the bad news, because we have among ourselves a relatively homogeneous group, and we miss the opportunity to hear the voice, as you said, Paul, of the other parts of ourselves, our family members, our friends, our colleagues who look different from us. I think there's an opportunity for all of us here in this moment to find ways to invite a broader perspective for dialogue. At the same time, I find it to be true that over history, we're the ones who have been the colonializers. We're the ones who have often been the perpetrators. Ergo, we have the opportunity to take the moment now and say, no longer on my watch. And I think part of that is the integration of our interior parts. No, I won't play this way anymore. I won't cooperate with that. Here are the things I want to do, we may want to do together to change this thing called racism, to upend it. So I find tremendous both grief inside of me a year out and hope at the same time. And I think about Andrew Harvey's work on sacred activism, and find that it brings me back to my own knees and brings me back to us here to keep talking. Something I have heard you say many times, George, over the years is, in dialogue, we move toward inquiry as compared with advocacy. What we're not doing is harping on our point, but we're asking the other, the parts of ourselves that are other, tell me more. I want to understand this.
Michael, did you have something that you were about to say?
Yes, George, thank you very much. For me, there's a simple formula that helps solve this dilemma, this paradox. Are we one or are we separate? And I think the difficulty with it is that we're in the West and modern civilization today, we tend to be either or people. So if we can discern any differences between us, then we can't be one. And that's seeing everything on one surface. So the formula, which I don't think anyone here would disagree with, is that we, each human being, is mind, body, and spirit. Or let's put it this way, body, mind, and spirit. So on the level of body, as bodies, we are separate. As spirit, we cannot be separate. Consciousness cannot be divisible. And mind is somewhere in between. It's how we turn our attention to the unity or the disunity. And the separateness is absolutely what you want on the physical level. That's where diversity comes in. And unity is absolutely what you want on the level of spirit or consciousness. And so I was reading an article in the local paper shortly after the George Floyd tragedy happened, and it said, let's teach anti-racism in the schools. And my immediate reaction as a lifelong educator was, no, let's teach the unity of life. Then the diversity on the surface will fall into place and will no longer be a threat, be a challenge. So that's the key, to see that we are, deep. We're deep. As a friend of mine says, we're evolving spiritual beings. Oh, and by the way, Gordy, this brings back the question of evolution. And my simplistic answer would be that on the level of body, we're completely evolved. On the level of spirit, we're just, we've hardly begun to realize our full potential. And when we look at someone like Mother Teresa or Mahatma Gandhi, what we're looking at is somebody who has precisely realized that potential by being grounded in spirit and appreciative of physical differences. So thank you, George. That was a lot, but it got it off my chest.
I want to say thank you, Michael. That's brought up a few things for me. Everyone is saying, and what an amazing question, Jim. I see it as in that vein that we're entering an initiation at this time, sort of a completely different relationship to life itself, to the world. And everything that's up right now is giving us an opportunity to dive into our highest selves. And I see it's like, everything has to come to a head. I don't know why I keep seeing this image of just everything coming. I mean, there's volcanoes, all of that is happening. Seismic change, change on every level, soul flares, everything is happening to transform us. And so to me, when things like George Floyd, the horrendous happening, was right in our face, it's showing me that, okay, it's terrible to admit that something has to get really bad before it gets better. But that's what I'm feeling, is that we're coming to a place where we're being offered a choice to not resist, but to go into, and I think Gordy touched on that, or Michael touched on that a little bit. If I can just be willing to see the similarities in someone, and even see what's going on as an opportunity for me to find a way to not resist, but to open to all the good, to see the similarities in every person, even the people I disagree with. And I think that's what's up right now, is that we're just to become grounded in who we are and to rise up wisely at this time. It's an offering, right along with climate change and everything else. It's all an offering to me for us to find solution within. And again, just to see the similarities. Our job is to promote peace right now and find solutions. And we're dreaming a new realization into being anyway in each new moment. So if we dream wisely right now, if we really keep seeing the vision of it's coming together, no matter how it looks, it's really coming together. And I'm recalling something Celeste said about her interaction with that woman in the department store, where she looked over and found a similarity, said, "What's your name?" A connection. Our interconnectedness is what's it's time. It's just time for it. So that's a very roundabout way of saying what was in my heart. Thank you.
I'm seeing some interesting comments in the chat. Marilyn asks, so is the vaccine for Wetiko to simply offer compassion? Is there anything more, that we can do about all of that? And I think it's, and you also said, Marilyn, I think can be done by those not infected. I think at some level that virus exists in all of us. So we're all infected. The question is whether or not we have our autoimmune system at work, and we use compassion and creativity and love and harmony and understanding as antiviral medicines in our everyday existence. I also think when Paul was talking before about, and I thought about this yesterday, the image of that cop, kneeling on George Floyd's neck, I realized that yesterday, as the discussion was going on in Congress, that there is a white majority in Congress, especially in the Senate, that is doing the same thing to the neck of America. And they're kneeling on it, and they're preventing us from breathing and progressing. And so one of my questions is, how do we reach them? Clearly, they're immune to political influence because they think that they're cocooned. But our job is to do that. And that's, I think, where something that Celeste just said about sacred or conscious activism comes in. We need to get up off our couches and our chairs, and we need to do what our hearts motivate us to do. To let people who are kneeling on the neck of America know that it is unacceptable. Because right now, the majority of people who voted for a change in the presidency and who are anxious about the future, we're being relatively silent, and we need to speak up. That's one of the ways that I think we can, in love, in harmony, in understanding, and a willingness to listen. But above all, we have to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Gordy. And then Tom.
Make sure I'm not on mute here. For quite a long time since seeing James Cameron's movie Avatar, I've been impressed by the way the creatures on that planet, the beings, greeted each other. And the greeting was, "I see you. I see you." And I'm not the first to suggest that the systemic violence and racism we see in our world is the result of simply not seeing the other. We have. Ralph Ellison wrote a book, The Invisible Man. What is it like to not be seen? Because when you're not being seen, what's happening is you're the subject of a projection. The projection, Paul, you talk about the projection of our shadow onto the other. And that is really the result of fear. And so that really brings me to the main point here. A number of years ago, my wife and I were interviewing Cynthia Bourgeault, who's just a wonderful mystic, on the subject of what is it that blocks discernment and wise guidance. And Cynthia said, the first thing we must learn is how to domesticate our fear. The first thing we must learn is how to domesticate our fear. And boy, that is such a big question in this world today, this world of uncertainty, paranoia, misinformation. But I come back, Michael, to the educational arena, to where we can, I think, maybe have, even though that's long term, but where we can have our most productive results, and that is to create a truly relational environment for children from the very beginning, where we actually see them, and then they can see one another, and that they're not subject to fear. And I'll just add that we're learning a lot from the neuroscientists.
people like Stephen Porges and his polyvagal theory, that we're wired to do one of two things: protect or connect. And when we move into fear, when the amygdala takes over, we're into protect. And that's where we begin to project our shadow onto the other, because that's the consequence of fear. But I think our largest project, perhaps, if we were to courageously enter a new era for humanity and for the planet, is to really learn to domesticate our fear.
Tom, were you?
Yeah, thank you, George. That was beautiful, Cordy. Thank you. And maybe just picking up on a couple of themes that were shared. So certainly, and not in any way to diminish the impact of racism, but racism is one symbol of making or identifying people as other. And that's certainly a problem that we as a society have to deal with, and as a world we need to deal with. The leadership issue that you touched on, George, is another area. But an area that I find a lot of hope in is that, like the caterpillar that is born with imaginal cells to become the butterfly, and it destroys itself in the process of becoming the butterfly, I truly believe that the youth that are coming into this world with imaginal cells. And they have something beyond the DNA that each of us on the screen have. And we have a responsibility, we have a role as baby boomers, as millennials, to support Gen Z, to support these youth that are coming into this world, to activate those imaginal cells that they have, that I don't believe each of us on the screen have. And to support them, and to share the wisdom, to share the guidance, to give them what they need to activate those imaginal cells for the world to become what it's wanting to become. And that's another piece beyond just the othering that's going on, beyond the leadership, beyond so many of the other symptoms that we have in the society. And our, picking on the conversation around the educational system, the mass educational system in this country was built on and came out of the manufacturing environment. It was focused on efficiency, and it served us well in so many ways around the 3 R's of reading, writing, and arithmetic, but it has done such a disservice to our society. And until we can help foster the kind of learning environment that these children have need for, and their imaginal cells, and activating those imaginal cells, we're going to continue to suffer, and we're going to continue to see forces at work to prop up these old systems that have outlived their time. And it's time to hospice those old systems out and midwife in the new systems that will help support this kind of society in the world that we're so hungry for and in need of.
Bobby, can I ask your companion there to Larry? We're seeing a lot of comments on the chat, that really relate to the separation versus the oneness. Can you speak to that bridge?
Yeah, maybe I can. I've been sitting here thinking that there's something missing in the debate about whether or not we're individuals, or whether we come together and transcending individuality in a common communitarian direction. This debate about particulate individuality and something else has been played out before in science at a deep level, and it's called complementarity. And this is a concept that arose out of investigations into physics earlier in the century. And basically, the idea is that an electron can be either a particle or a wave, depending on circumstances, how you look at it, how you investigate it. It's not one or the other. So this debate about whether or not we're individuals inherently, or we come together, is, I think, a faux argument. We're both of those properties are who we are. And so I don't think we should be forcing ourselves into one box or the other. We're a composite. In some ways, we're individuals. In some levels, we come together as one. I must confess that I'm pushed in this direction by virtue of being an identical twin. And from as far back as I can remember, my brother and I had difficulty about, well, am I you or you me? Or, I mean, we would think the same things. So I may come at this from a different level than most people, but for me, it's just axiomatic. We're both. To compound my confusion, I happen to be married to a twin. I don't know why I deserve this, but I got a double dose of this, both and stuff. I can't escape it. I mean, it's just, it seems to be the way the world works. Imagine my surprise when I found all of these studies, and I'm not talking about 2 or 3, I'm talking about scores of studies that are in the scientific books these days that show that we can actually converse with each other at a distance. I mean, this is what the whole of parapsychological research is all about. One of the most ignored bodies of scientific data on the planet. Sooner or later, we're going to have to wake up in our own defense and recognize that we're in all of this together. There's no secession, no pulling out in favor of individuality. Individuality is fine as far as it goes, but it's only part of who we are. I think this is one of the greatest stumbling blocks in the human contemporary thought. And if we don't transcend this either or way of thinking, we're going to be the worse off because of it.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Barbie, I interrupted you.
No,
I'm sorry.
Just to spin off of a few words that have been used, and particularly fears. And what I'm seeing is it's really important for us to look at the interdependence of opposites. So if you look at what we value, the upside of that, but then on the other side of it is fears, what we don't recognize. If we can balance our values and our fears and bring them together, we have more capacity to really move forward in a win-win and to open up a dialogue. And I think it's just, for example, one thing I see is a nurse. We're always looking at, let's get the staff's, the patient satisfaction scores up. What are they doing with the staff? Nothing. So it just falls down. So it's just like this. And what we have to do is work simultaneously on staff satisfaction and the patient satisfaction. And there we have this marvelous win-win, and the creativity emerges where the caring and healing comes together. Another one too is looking at life balance and work balance. I think all of us on this call can certainly look at, we have so much work that's going on. We work. And if we don't take time for ourselves, all of a sudden we're exhausted, we're overwhelmed, we can contact the fears. But when we pull them together and try to find that balance, then we do come into a new way of being, and we open up a dialogue, and we open up what we've closed down. Thank you.
Jim, how long do you want this to go? What would you like?
Well, we're a little past time, but this is such a rich discussion and dialogue. I don't want to cut it off prematurely, but I'm wondering maybe we could think about wrapping up. And I don't know, George, whether you're thinking of having final comments from people or how you were planning to conclude it, but probably good to start that process.
Larry?
I would just like to leave a comment that I think is crucial. This idea that we're all together as one, as a human unit that knows no boundaries, sounds like wonderful philosophy. But I just want to suggest that going on in science we're faced now with scores of studies that show that this is not just philosophy, but if you put this to a test and stimulate different brains that are thousands of miles apart, you see simultaneous changes in brain function, taking this idea of oneness and unity out of philosophy and anchoring it into solid, demonstrable science. And if there's anybody out there who thinks that this group is just engaging in California woo-woo, togetherness, oneness, and unity stuff, you need to rethink that. This is solid science, and it's time that human beings in general got with the program and admitted and acknowledged and honored our unity because it's real.
Good.
Michael has his hand up, George.
Yep. And Celeste next.
Hey.
And then Paul.
I'll try to be brief, though I don't feel like it. Not going on and on. Just two quick things. Larry, I wanted to just share with you that in October, my granddaughter will be giving birth to fraternal twins. And she's Chinese and my grandson is Jewish. So it's going to be very interesting, the identity issue there. But more to the point and a little less personally, I came up with a formula as we're talking, and maybe I should have done this decades ago. But okay, if we accept as a working model that we're body, mind, and spirit, I would say that as bodies we're separate, as minds we're similar, and as spirit we're one.
Celeste, please.
Sure. Michael, thanks for that. You give me a nice segue to something that I've been thinking about as I've listened to all of us. And in particular, Gordon, I loved your bringing back in Avatar, the I see you, the way people greeted each other. And then Larry, your passion around our interconnectedness and oneness. And what comes to me is the word Ubuntu, which many of you may well know, comes from Mother Africa. It loosely translated means I see you, therefore I am. In other words, the relational field is what brings us into full humanity. And without other, either inside of us or outside of us, is there a difference? Without that, we are not. And for me, that takes us right back to your initial question, Jim. What about George Floyd? We all came from Mother Africa. We know that, it's science. Time for us to do our job.
Paul, I think, and then Tom.
Yeah, I just noticed I'm sitting here and I'm kind of having this shaking just from the excitement of what everybody's saying, because it touches really deep places in me. And the one thing I wanted to say the whole time really is that, I think we're all, kind of in phase around the madness that's playing out and the evil that's coming to the fore and acting itself out. And it's great to have all these ideas and philosophy and stuff like that. But, for me, what it really comes down to is that by our nature, we're these creative beings, and we have this immense creative power. And we have it right now, 24/7, and all of us have it. And for me, what's at the root of the madness of the virus of the mind is that we're not consciously in touch with our nature as creative beings. And so that then gets turned against us in a way that's killing us. And we're seeing that evidence all over the planet. So I just wanted to be the voice. And I think, this is really what everyone's saying in these different ways, of the profound importance, of not just sitting on our couch, stepping up in a participatory way and accessing that creative spirit. And particularly when we hang out with other people who are also plugging into that, then it creates a field that's a contagious field where we actually can help each other to implement our creative genius in a way that's been unimaginable up until now. So thank you.
John?
There were a couple of comments or questions in the chat I just wanted to speak to because they haven't been addressed. One was around the doctrine of discovery. And Michael and I had a chance last December to lead a one-day retreat with over 600 leaders of the Catholic Church in a dialogue around gospel nonviolence. And we screened the film, The Third Harmony. And in that conversation, and out of that conversation, there was, and there is an ongoing active conversation within the Catholic Church to really look at the doctrine of discovery. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it was an edict by the church that when the explorers went out into the world, if they discovered natural resources or other forms of life, as the discoverers, they had dominion over them. And the church is really looking at the impact of the doctrine of discovery and the impact it's had over the last several centuries. And the church is, as I've been told, is looking at reevaluating the impact of the doctrine of discovery. And it's a very hopeful sign because it's resulted in so much of the damage that we've experienced in the world for many centuries. There was another question about fear. And one of the models I use in the work I do around conscious leadership is that there are 4 states of consciousness. And the lower 2 states, one being I'm the victim of circumstance, and the other is that the shadow side of my ego is in control of my life, are both fear-based. And each of us have an opportunity to shift from that lower states of consciousness, which are fear-based, into the higher states of consciousness, which are love-based. And so in response to the question in the chat, that would be a suggestion I would offer, is just each of us looking at how we're living our lives. And are we living from a place of trust and love, or are we living from a place of fear? And that's a personal choice that each of us need to make moment by moment in our daily lives.
Terry, we haven't heard from you.
Oh, Terry.
Well, okay, you can hear from me. Sorry, I was a little late. I have a 5-year-old son who's in kindergarten. I have to take him to school. So, so I missed the beginning, but I got pieces here, and this is probably relevant. Every time I drop him off at school, there are about 3 other kids that run up and hug him. And these are kids that are 5 and 6 years old. And what I see, and I'm reminded of constantly, is the kid inside of me. And I've literally worked in 100 countries. Anybody who's traveled that much will say something to this effect: we are more alike than we are different. And the idea of the soul, in the soul, we're the same. And it isn't that hard to see that in people, even the ones who are doing evil behaviors. Well, maybe it is hard, but it's possible, and it's a choice. And when I get positioned, which has been more frequent than I like this last year, because I got a position about what's going on and what I don't like, the question I ask myself is whether would I rather be right or loving? And when I look at it that way, it's an obvious choice. I'd rather be loving. And okay, how do I do that in this situation or this position or this belief? I don't always have the answer, but I have the intention. And the minute I make that choice toward the loving instead of the righteousness and the anger and the judgment and all of that, if one thing shifts, my experience in me is better. And then it starts to reflect outside of me. So all that from the 5-year-old wisdom this morning that I get every day. I could go on and on, but there you go.
Yeah.
Sedina, closing comment?
Yeah, thanks for that, Terry. It's that inner child you're reminding me too. That's what I think I mentioned before. I'm trying to see that in everybody, even someone that, it's very difficult to see, but the brightness, the light within, and to remember the child within me, and to really, I think reparenting ourselves is really an important piece because we haven't been domesticated in the proper values, right? To use that word domestication again. I just love Michael's conclusion of mind, body, spirit, the spirit all being one. And I love what everybody's saying. And going back to Larry's constant, reflection on oneness, which is, to me, I just don't think there's anything more important right now. We're denying our wholeness. Let's face it, George Floyd is just a huge example of that. And that's what's up for us, is our wholeness, our interconnectedness. And Celeste touched on that too. Ubuntu, is so important right now. Can we see each other? Can we remember who we are as humans in our humanity? And what I just come back to over and over is that love is what releases fear. So I just appreciate all of you so much. Beautiful comments and wonderful questions from the chat too. This is great. Thank you.
So just one tiny comment in terms of how we deal with Wetiko. I think we have to do a lot more that's experiential and a lot less that's intellectual. It's the combination of experiential learning, experiential interaction with each other. I think that's where the oneness begins to come from, and we get to experience it. Over the years, I've been privileged to both participate and lead a huge number of transformational seminars and programs and whatnot. And what I always found was that people came into a room feeling separate. After a set of common experiences and interactions, there was an enormous amount of commonality and an understanding that we are much more alike than different. So with that, Jim, turn it back over to you.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Sedina, and thank you, everyone. This has been quite an extraordinary exercise in dialogue, and I think it's very much appreciated by the 15, 20,000 people who are watching it today. And hopefully, as the recording gets out there, I would close, I think, with your last comment, George, which seems to me to be seminal. And that is, what does dialogue mean, really? Particularly in terms of efficacy in the face of Wetiko. And just to pick up, Larry, on a comment you made a couple times about this proposition, scientific data, that it's all interrelated oneness. I think that's not what people find as woo-woo. I think what people find as woo-woo is the applicability of that reality in the real world. And I would love to raise this as maybe a final challenge to this group, George, because I know we're going to be doing it down the road. And that's the question, is what does dialogue mean when the reality has completely gone beyond dialogue? And just to take an example of what's going on in the United States at the moment, in the news last night, it said 53% of all Republicans believe that not only was a fraudulent election, but that Trump was still basically president. 53%. There was an interview with the president of the Arizona Senate, Republican, who has been orchestrating this completely fraudulent vote count. And her certainty about a reality that from the outside in is completely delusional raises a fundamental question, I think, that's up for America. It's up for democracy, and is inherent in the death of George Floyd, is what Derek Chauvin kept his knee on the neck of George Floyd a full 3 minutes after George Floyd was dead. He was impervious to the pleas of the bystanders for any kind of compassion. And when he got up, there was a smirk on his face. And he has not apologized to the present day. So I think one of the questions against which my mind shatters actually is, how do you apply the rhetoric that we've heard today against the anvil of a nation that has split apart and can no longer find common ground anywhere, not even on vaccines, not even on COVID. We're in this reality where Watiko, this insanity of the spirit, has so gripped the collective psyche that the manifestations of it, the centrifugal force of it, is proving itself to be stronger than the integrating force of the reality of what we all know to be true. So, George, I would love a discussion that would start with this basic contradiction, because everybody is suffering from the inability of anyone really to think their way through. And just to take a moment, you see President Biden, dealing with a Senate and Republicans in the House that are stating in advance they won't compromise. What does one do? And it reminds me of Paul Schmuckler's book. If you remember Paul Schmuckler's book about 25 years ago called The Parable of the Tribe. And it was a powerful book because he asked this question. And the parable was a group of people all kind of sharing the watering hole and kind of getting along reasonably peacefully. And then over the hill comes marauding warriors on horses, swords drawn, that have no intent on sharing the water. What does one do in the face of that? So for me, this has been a brilliant dialogue about the truth. And I would love a subsequent discussion with this group on what is that, what do we do when the anvil has proven itself to be so strong that democratic processes, dialogic processes, are no longer effective in securing the unity that we all seek. That feels to me to be a $64,000 question that I would love the genius of this group to take on, George and everyone, if that's something that you would find of interest. We can maybe carry on this dialogue afterward. We're significantly over time, but it's been such a rich discourse that I wanted to let it go and then maybe tee it up for our next session or two, because I think people would love to have your reflections on that. One of the things we're doing, for example, at Ubiquity, just before closing, we're having a whole course, 7-day course in July, on dialectica, the second of the liberal arts, which is on dialogue. How do you interact with the opposites? And the framework for the dialogue is the intersectionality between gender and sexuality on the one hand, and race and ethnicity on the other, because both those contradictions are really up for the world. And so I really want to thank everyone for joining. We've gone quite a bit longer, but I think it's been, every minute has been worth it. And we'll have George and this group and others back next month. And then tomorrow, everyone, we're going to Europe to the Nordic Health 2030 movement and the European Future Health Forum for a discussion on the urgent necessity of understanding that one of the central challenges coming out of this pandemic is the question of public health. And how do we secure public acceptance for the kind of healthcare systems that we need, both in terms of physical safety, but in terms of mental health and psycho-emotional safety that have proven themselves to be so fragile as we've all traversed this pandemic. So that's tomorrow on Humanity Rising. So thank you, everyone. Those of you who can join the after session chat, please do. And we'll see you here again tomorrow on Humanity Rising. But thank you, everyone, George and Sadina, all of you, thank you so much. This has been rich beyond measure. Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
Jim.
Thanks so much, Jim.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
So